Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into a couple of classic Pilsners. One of my favorite styles. It's just hard to beat a Pilsner. It's just one of those classic, crisp, refreshing beer styles. Every time you have a sip, you're just like, yeah, that's what beer's all about. And I absolutely love them. So today we're going to be visiting a couple brewers that we know quite well here. A couple of very excellent brewers. Everything I've had by them has been spot on. So I'm very much looking forward to see what their Pilsner game is about. Today we're going to be starting with Freemont Brewing Company's Golden Pilsner. They're based in Seattle, Washington. This one clocks in at 4.5% ABV. And then number two, we're moving over to Adroit Theory's Obolus. This is Ghost 814 if you track their ghost numbers on their beers. Also, just a standard Pilsner, no additives, 5% ABV on that one, and they are based in Purcellville, Virginia. So two beers that are just classic Pilsners, nothing added, nothing funky, only 0.5% apart, and both well right in the median range for a Pilsner style. So I'm very much looking forward to jumping into these. We're going to do exactly that, starting with Fremont Brewing's Golden Pilsner. This one clocks in at 4.5% ABV. Okay, so jumping right into the first beer of today's Pilsner review, we've got Fremont Brewing's Golden Pilsner. They're based in Seattle, Washington. This one clocks in at 4.5% ABV. Both beers in today's review, yet again, I did procure from Tavour. So, starting with the label art on this one has what looks like, I don't know, perhaps a crane or a scarlet ibis. I'm not the biggest avian expert, but it looks like a type of bird that I see often down here in Florida. Very, very cool, very black can with a nice clean design on it. So we're going to get this one cracked gently, and we're going to pour the Pilsners into my Sierra Nevada can glass that I got for Christmas from my brother. Cool little glass. So let's pour this straight in. Oh yeah. That is a classic Pilsner appearance if ever there were one. Light straw, pale yellow color. It looks lovely. And nice active carbonation and forming a nice white head on top. All the classic recipe of a classic Pilsner. So, visually, that is spot on. That's what I picture in my head when I think of a Pilsner. Just a beautiful light, pale yellow, almost straw colored. And it's lovely. Very, very tiny bubbles that are still coming up. It's not super fast, but they're very tiny, fine and tight champagne-like bubbles. Bit of a tongue twister. Head on this one is actually already starting to settle down just a little bit. It's a little surprising. I probably could have been a bit more aggressive, but that's okay. Let's get over and give it a sniff. Oh, yeah. Oh, that smells like a classic Pils. That smells like any number of my favorite German and Czech Pilsners. It's got that distinct kind of baked good malt bill that you smell on a Pilsner, and it's got just this slight earthy hop aroma to it and a slight honey sweetness. And this one, yeah, it's got, just this beautiful mix. It's almost like a perfect mix of that malt bill, the honey, and the slight earthiness from the hops. It smells fantastic. This smells just like a quintessential Czech or German Pilsner. So we're going to jump right in, see what this one's about. I can't wait. Ooh. Oh, that's a nice Pils. Oh, yeah. Oh, God, I love a good Pilsner. Wow. Wow. If you stuck this in a lineup filled with German and or Czech Pilsners, there is no reality that I would be able to say, oh, that's an American. That's an American. No, absolutely not. It tastes just like it came straight out of the Czech Republic or Germany. Really, really nice. The first thing that you get is just how prominent that malt bill flavor is. It's got that classic Pilsner malt bill. It's got this undercurrent of bread and crust and crumbs and biscuit, and it's just so crisp and delicious. Now, speaking of crispness, on the end of the finish, this one's actually pretty wet and round for quite a bit of time before it gets that classic, crisp, dry finish on the end. It's not super short. This one is not short at all. It gives you a lot more length before it just cleanly finishes it off. In terms of the flavors that are coming through and mixing with the malt bill, it matches exactly what I got on the aroma. There's this slight honey sweetness, and there's a little bit of this earthiness from the hops, but the hops in this one are very subtle bitters. Some Pilsners are a bit more heavy-handed with the hops. This one's very light-handed. This one seems to be all about the right yeast strain paired with the right malt bill, and they did it very, very, very well. Very tasty. In terms of the body and the mouthfeel, the body on this, on a nice light Pils, as you might expect, it's not heavy, though I would say it's a medium light. It's a medium light. It's got a little more heft than I anticipated for the style in the ABV range. In terms of the mouthfeel, I wouldn't say that it's viscous, but it's not flat like water. But one thing I noticed right away, as soon as you start even the slightest bit of agitation around the pellet, it gets incredibly creamy. And it really does almost kind of just this light, fluffy, thick, foamy cream is the texture that it goes in the mouth. So it makes it feel like it's a lot more resistant than it actually is. In fact, if I take just a small sip here, no aeration, hard habit to break. Yeah, feels exactly like you'd expect. It's when you agitate around the palate, that's when it really becomes impressively large and creamy. In terms of how the flavor develops, it's almost all of it right up front. It's big malt bill with the yeast strain paired with just this very subtle, earthy hops. It's classic. It's like they picked something super light, maybe even lighter than Fuggles, but it's super light like that with a nice classic earthy hop flavor characteristic and just the light hand. It's just there as like part of the ingredient bill, but it's not trying to be an overtly pungent Pilsner. Very crisp, very refreshing. In Tampa, this is a beer I go to frequently because it does get hot down in Tampa, Florida. It's a hot day today and we're only in mid-March 2020, and honestly, it's delicious today. It's really hitting the spot. There's not really much I could fault about this beer. I do personally like a little more of a hop bite to my Pilsners, but they're all different and they run the gamut. It's not requisite for the style, but this would be one that somebody that doesn't really like bitter beers, this is one to go for. It's nice. That honey sweetness comes through very clearly in that classic malt bill. It's just delicious together. In terms of the balance, again, I personally could use a little more hops, but it's not really requisite or necessarily the norm for the style to have overtly pungently bitters present on the Pils. You typically get a little suggestion, and there is a suggestion here, but it's not over the top. Overall, I really like this one. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get to the second beer of today's Pilsner review. That is Adroit Theory's Obolus Ghost 814. That one clocks in at 5% ABV. Okay, now jumping into the second beer of today's Pilsner review, we have got Adroit Theory's Obolus. This is Ghost 814, if you like to track their ghost numbers. 5% ABV on this one. They are based in Purcellville, Virginia. So starting with label art. The label art on this one is pretty interesting. I don't know what to say it looks like other than it's pretty creepy. It's got, I don't know, kind of a Grim Reaper looking something with a coin in his hand. I have no idea. It almost looks like something out of a nightmare, like Greek mythology or something. I have no idea. But it's very creepy and very cool can art. It's very well done. It looks neat. So let's get this one cracked gently. All right. We're going to get this poured right in. Obviously, this isn't going to hold the whole beer, which is fine. Yep. As I'm pouring this, classic light straw pale yellow. Let's give a little more agitation down the top. All right. Absolutely looks exactly as I would expect from a Pilsner. Now, notably, I can tell you, after this settled and formed the head, the carbonation rising up in this one is not nearly going as bonkers, but it is that classic, very superfine champagne, like just tiny little streams I can still see coming up. And yeah, the head formed on this one about like it did in the other. So we'll see how long it sticks around, but let's give it a sniff. Yeah, okay, so this, again, smells very much like a classic Pilsner. What I can tell you on this one, I don't get as much honey sweetness on the nose, but a lot more of this biscuity quality to it. And there's definitely a little more pronounced hop presence. It smells a little more hoppy. And again, It is kind of very typical, as you see in a Pilsner, that kind of earthy type hops. It's not a West Coast style with pine resin notes or tropical fruit. It's very much that classic earthy hop. So it smells very nice. It's just dominated a lot more by the hop and really specifically the kind of biscuity side of the malt bill than it is anything else. And I'm not really picking up any real honey sweet aromas at all. It's very much hop and biscuit. So without further ado, let's jump in. Oh yeah, absolutely. That's another very, very good Pilsner. Both of these very, very good. And although similar, same style, they are distinctly different. This one, really, exactly what I picked up on the nose again is what translated into the glass. So the malt characteristic is a lot more forward on this beer. And it is really that kind of classic biscuity side, that biscuit and maybe like buttered toast. It's really quite nice. It's one of my favorite aspects of Pilsners is their malt bill. It's very distinct. There are a few other beer styles that share similar traits, but you know a Pilsner when you're drinking it. Very clean, very crisp. In terms of how it finishes, it's very wet and round and full until the very end. It's got a very sudden kind of crisp dryness to the bite. It's not super dry. It's not a brute. It's that classic Pilsner crispness to it. As for the bitters, yeah, this is definitely more bitter than the last one. And it is, again, that very classic kind of profile that you find in a Pilsner. It's that kind of earthy bitter that's coming through. It's not big West Coast style. It's not fruit. It's not juicy. It's not resinous. It's that classic earthy hop profile that's coming through that just goes so well with that malt bill and the yeast. In terms of any sense of honey quality, there is a little bit of one. It comes on right about the 5-ish second mark after the intensity of the malt bill hits you up front and then the intensity of the bitters hit you. It backs up and then a little bit of a honey-like sweetness comes through and then it immediately kind of dies back down. So you've really almost got two kind of ramping bell curves. It starts very very intense, riding up the intensity curve of the malts, and the hops are following almost that very same curve, only about a second or two behind it. And then there's just like this smaller bell that comes up with this honey sweetness as the other two on their way down. It's just like a little bump. It's very, very nice. The interplay of flavors is very, very nice. And it's, as you would expect from a Pilsner, it's just incredibly refreshing. Everything about this beer style screams refreshing to me. On a hot day, this is one of my absolute go-to styles. It is one of those that just feels like it quenches your thirst very, very well. It's nice and clean and crisp. It's just a no-nonsense beer style, and I absolutely love it. I'm going to jump back in for body and mouthfeel. Think on the flavor development a bit more. Body on this is medium light. Pretty much what I'd expect for this ABV range. The mouthfeel, very much what you would expect from a Pilsner. It's got a slight bit of resistance. It's pretty effervescent in the mouth, but it's not what you would call thick. This one, though, just as with the first beer in today's review, if you start to agitate around the palate to let the flavors cut around, it does get very creamy, very foamy. And it's thickened. It's not bubbly and airy. It just thickens it. So it adds this other textural dynamic to it. Very, very nice. In terms of second sip, if I pick up anything different in the flavors, not really. Really, all that I can say is with subsequent sips, it just intensifies because the flavors of this one really do linger around the palate a good bit. Even though it has that classic kind of crisp dryness to the finish, on the back of the palate, the flavors on this one are lingering quite a bit longer than your average Pilsner. And really, it's a combination of that biscuity, crusty, toasty, mixed with that earthy, hop, bitter element side. Very, very nice Pilsner. I'm going to jump in for one more sip here. It's so good. That malt bill, then boom, the hops, and the slight honey sweetness, and they all kind of blend together. Hold that intensity for a second, then they start their descent. Now it's coming down. It's starting to get that crisp dryness, but the flavors are still lingering all over the palate. Really, really good beer. Really good beer. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both beers, we're going to get them ranked. Starting with Freemont Brewing's Golden Pilsner, 4.5% ABV on this one. They are based in Seattle, Washington. Starting with the aroma. The aroma on this beer was very nice. It smelled very much like a classic German or Czech Pilsner. Slight honey sweetness on the nose. You could smell that very biscuity malt bill. And it also had that classic, slightly earthy hop aroma to it. In terms of pungency, it was above average, but not quite as present as many. It does get a 7 out of 10. For the taste, I really, really enjoyed the taste on this beer. Most of the elements of this did, again, remind me very much of a classic German or Czech Pilsner. Just in terms of the flavor profile, how it presented itself. Very biscuity, very bread and crust-like. Classic Pilsner characteristic there. Also did have some of that underlying honey sweetness. The hop characteristic that came through was very much an earthy hop bite, but it was very subtle with the bitters here. That was really the only thing that held it back for me personally in terms of what it brought to the table. So it had all the hallmarks there. It just was just so subtle with the bittering. It lacked that bite. But overall, I enjoyed the flavor. Above average. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the body is exactly what you would expect of a Pilsner. It was nice and light, felt exactly right. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Mouthfeel, same story here. Had that classic light, only slight viscosity to it, nice effervescence. It felt like a Pilsner should. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish on this beer was longer than average for a Pilsner, and it did still have that classic Pilsner crispness to the end, but it lacked the hop pungency, the lingering bitters to really help extend out the finish. If they had made a little more bitter forward nature to this one, it easily would have been in the top Pilsners I'm sure that I've ever reviewed. But as it were, it's above average. It still gets a 7 out of 10. For the head and retention, this one did okay. It formed at the start very much what looked like a classic Pilsner head, and it was high end of average here, but really it dissipated far quicker than your average Pilsner, and that's what really held it back. High end of average, it gets a 6 out of 10. For the appearance, this was exactly what I picture in my head when I think of a Pilsner. That classic straw pale yellow, it gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance, overall, I liked the balance of this. Really, the same thing that held it back on the balance side was what held it back on the taste side. The bitters were so subtle that it felt like it was missing an element. I mean, it was there, but it was exceptionally subtle. Overall, though, the balance of everything else was fantastic, so grand scheme of things, it was above average. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the feeling and the intangible, I very much enjoyed this beer. I think they had a very good built recipe for making a classic Czech or German style Pilsner. Really, again, for me, just needed more bitters. Gets a 7 out of 10. Finally, is an example of the style. Yet again, very, very well done Pilsner for all the same reasons that I mentioned previously in other categories. And again, it's the same reason that it held the score back a bit. It just needed a little more bigger hop bite, just some additional bitters to come through. Everything else about it, I absolutely love. That was the only missing element for me. But again, I thought it was overall above average. It gets a 7 out of 10, which brings the total score on Freemont Brewing's Golden Pilsner to a 78 out of 100. So absolutely, this is above average. People that don't like quite as bitter of a Pils or bitter beers in general, you're probably really going to like this one. It was absolutely delicious. Moving on to beer number 2. This is Adroit Theory's Obolus. Slightly higher ABV on this one at 5%. They are based in Purcellville, Virginia. For the aroma on this beer was not super pronounced. It was high end of average, but you really had to sniff very deeply to get a sense. And it was a little hard to pick out what I might be getting into in terms of flavor profile, but high end of average, it gets a 6 out of 10. For the taste The taste on this one, I really enjoyed. This one, again, reminded me a lot of a classic German or Czech style Pilsner, but what this one had going for it was it did have a noticeable hop bite. There were far more bitters present in this one, which overall made for a more balanced flavor profile. I only dock 1 point here. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the body, just as with the first, it was exactly what you'd expect for a Pils in this ABV range. It gets a 10 out of 10. Mouthfeel, same story here, exactly what I expected. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish on this one was far longer than your average Pilsner, and it really did come down to the fact that it was readily apparent that it was more heavily hopped. I'm not saying they were trying to make a Pilsner in an IPA kind of looking glass at all, but it definitely was far more bitter and hop forward than your average Pilsner, and that did play a big part in extending the length of that finish because they did linger. Dock 1 point here, gets a 9 out of 10. Head retention. This one did a little bit better job than the first. They both looked like they were going to form very well, and they did, but both of them had a little bit of an issue with retention. They were quite active in terms of carbonation, and it just made the head collapse far quicker than your average Pils. Again, these are poured at home. I imagine both of these off of a tap would have been fantastic. It gets above average, 7 out of 10. For the appearance, this was perfect textbook Pilsner, gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was really quite nice. Really good balance struck between the malt bill, the yeast, and the hops, and of course the bitter engages that came through. Really on this one, the only thing that I thought maybe was a little bit out of whack, if it had that just a little more presence of that honey sweetness that you so often get with Pilsners. It's not in all of them, but it is far more the norm. I think I would have probably thought that this nailed it all around. As it were, only dock 1 point, it gets a 9 out of 10. Filling in the intangible. I loved this one. Honestly, these are two great Pilsners. To be brewing a Pilsner which is done so well for hundreds and hundreds of years by the Europeans, you know, it's nice that we have American craft brewers that are willing to do their take on it. And both of these share a lot of common ground with their European counterparts, but they are distinctly different. Overall, I like this a lot. It was one of the closest American representations I've had. It gets a 9 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style. Overall, I thought this was an exceptionally well done Pilsner. I really did. For me, it was just a few little minor tweaks, a little bit more of a slight honey presence in the flavor profile, and just a little bit better head and retention. Frankly, the aroma pungency I would have liked a little more as well. I like to know what I'm getting into when I sniff a beer. If you really got to work for it, we first taste beer with our nose. I mean, that's just the way that it is. But overall, this was a very strong example. Only docked 1 point. It gets a 9 out of 10, which brings the total score on Adroit Theory's Obolus to an 88 out of 100. So all total, we're only looking at a 10-point spread here, 78 and an 88. Both of these are well above average offerings. If you're a fan of Pilsners, absolutely, please do try as many American craft as you can. They're doing very interesting things with them, and they're all a little bit different. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.